As it's somewhat been established, I've got quite a thing for overhead single-screen racing games. No doubt it's from the earliest days of my gaming hobby, where I spent time with plenty of them on my trusty C64. Of course, I didn't really find myself missing them all that much when I moved over to a PC a few years later, at least initially. But as my habits and platforms changed, I got the cravings for them once again. Something which has been recently amplified by the announcement of Neosprint, Atari's latest installment in the Sprint series. I'm sure you're thinking, why not revisit an earlier game to satisfy the craving? And it's quite a good idea. Except doing that would mean I'd have to revisit the C64 version of Super Sprint, Neosprint's predecessor. Which, if I'm being honest, is not really a version of it I'd like to go back to. Super Sprint on the C64 wasn't all that great on release, and these days it's well and truly showing its age. Instead, I think it'd be more fun to look at some of the conversions which don't get talked about all that often. The first being for the NES and Famicom, and the second on the Game Boy Advance. Starting off with the Famicom release, which was published by Ultron in 1991, some 5 years after the arcade release, certainly sounds a bit off at first glance. Of course, it wasn't first released there, but it was originally developed for the US market, which was done by Tinier, Atari Games' home label, where it saw release in 1989. Now, of course, if you know how things happened in the US, you'd know that Super Sprint was technically an unlicensed release there, which I'm sure curtailed its popularity back in the day. But interestingly, this Famicom release is actually a legitimate one, so it's funny how the cookie crumbles and all of that. Now, I'm going to just touch on this briefly because there's not much which separates the two releases of the game. Only a few minor differences in presentation screens, which range from small text edits in some of them, to the rather odd removal of the credits screen from the Famicom's attract sequence. The thing is, what's really important is how the core gameplay is brought over. Super Sprint, of course, is a single-screen overhead racer which originally saw release in 1986. Unsurprisingly, it's the follow-up to the Sprint games which Atari and various subsidiaries released into arcades during the back half of the 1970s. Whilst those earlier games tasked players to drive as fast as possible to rack up a high score before time runs out, Super Sprint mixes things up by challenging you and up to 2 friends to beat the computer-controlled drone drivers over a series of 4-lap races. Along the way, you'll need to avoid increasing numbers of hazards whilst collecting the gold and spanners, which can be used to obtain upgrades for your car, raising your top speed, acceleration, or handling. Right off the bat, I feel Super Sprint for the NES and Famicom brings those mechanics over incredibly well, though it does make enough tweaks in the process to improve the experience where it's needed. The best example of this for me is in the controls. While the arcade machine featured free spinning wheels for steering and a great sense of understeer to your inputs, this conversion works the controls so that they're far snappier because, of course, using a digital controller means you don't have as much freedom. You'll have seen this if you've ever tried to emulate the arcade version without trying to dial in those steering controls, as you'll be familiar with how easy it is to do the opposite, not understeer, but actually oversteer while you're negotiating corners. And that'll eat up time and possibly end your game early if you're not careful. Now, these changes to the digital steering here in the NES and Famicom version really help with some of those later obstacles you're going to deal with as well. I'm looking at you in particular, you little crafty pole barriers. Another point of divergence is in the tracks. In the arcades, Super Sprint featured 8 courses for you to race about, before they looped over with more obstacles and faster opponents. On the NES and Famicom, that's been cut back to 7. I guess this is likely for cart size reasons, but it's a bit of a shame that it's happened regardless. Surprisingly, not all of these courses come from the original Super Sprint arcade game. Instead, some come from its sort of sequel, Championship Sprint, instead. I'm not really surprised by this, because these tracks feature a number of hazards which have been cut from the game as well. Those are, of course, the jumps, alongside the barriers which open and close, allowing for a crafty little shortcut. None of these bother me all that much, to be honest. In fact, I never even noticed the tracks were switched out because they all flow rather well, which is no surprise considering they all came from the same design team. But also, with the arcade game featuring rather high, at least for the time, resolution visuals, thanks to the System 2 arcade board they were built around, seeing them compressed for the lower resolution of a home system is honestly something that's to be expected. Plus, I never actually came across the arcade original of Super Sprint or Championship Sprint in their native habitats, so it might just be a case of me not knowing what I really missed in that form. There is a little twist in how the spanner pickups are handled. Each race provides two of them, the first appearing once the leader has completed their first lap, and the second when they start their final lap. So, you'll also only need to collect two of them to get a car upgrade. I believe this differs in other versions. On the C64 version that I'm most familiar with, it's 4 you have to get an upgrade. So a handy player, with the luck of the RNG on their side, might be able to pull off an upgrade after every race. And honestly, I think that helps quite a bit in helping maintain the challenge at a fair level when you're playing solo, because you've got to beat 3 rivals, not just 2 in that case. This happened more than a few times in my time playing the game and recording this footage. Not that I'm complaining, of course, because, like I mentioned, this really helps make the challenge fair for you, especially when you're playing solo. I also love the quality of life features which were added, namely, the ability to continue as many times as you like, should you fail to beat the drone drivers. And of course, a second player can join in any time between races. You're not stuck to starting a 1 or 2 player game here. Both of these go a long way to making things feel quite a bit more fun, even if continuing resets your score, though you still get to keep any upgrades you've installed to your car. All up, there's a fair increase in the challenge, and Super Sprint on the NES and Famicom is really quite a great example for me of how you can take an arcade game's core, bring it over to the home, but refine it for a different yet suitable play experience, but still gives you what the arcade game offers. It does it really well, and I think it's one that's well worth spending some time with. But squeezing down Super Sprint for play on the go? I don't know about you, but that feels like it's game making in hard mode. But in 2005, that just happened, as Destination Software would publish conversions of both it and Spy Hunter, both handled by Black Lantern Studios, on a 2-in-1 cartridge for the Game Boy Advance. Now from the outset, this one aims to be closer to the arcade game, but once again, it's a conversion rather than trying to emulate it, which of course we saw more of on more powerful systems around this time. It shouldn't be a surprise though, because as powerful as the Game Boy Advance was for that time frame, it was still not powerful enough to really be able to emulate the processor of the arcade game here, let alone handle the rest of it. Plus, imagine trying to squeeze down those visuals from that high-resolution arcade screen onto that of the Game Boy Advance, right? Right? It's pretty obvious right from the moment you've picked your starting track and begun your first race. The way in which the car sprites are redrawn for the smaller display really hinders readability. Now, I'm not sure if this is just my approaching mid-40-something-year-old eyes here, but I'm almost exclusively relying on memory for knowing which direction I've got the car moving in, rather than being able to tell just by looking at the sprite itself. It really is a concern if you're playing off the actual handheld, compared to just playing it on your computer emulated, or using something like a Game Boy player on a GameCube, or a docked analog pocket like I am here for the sake of capture. Now, of course, let's acknowledge it. That isn't how the game was intended to be played. You're intended to play it on a handheld on the go, and yeah, it's kind of a little tough like that. I guess it's just I wish the developers had taken some liberties with the conversion, like the folks at Tengen did. because I really think it could have done wonders for making this game more readable on these smaller screens. Now, of course, it's great the game loop is closer to the arcades too. All 8 courses are here, though obviously squished down in various degrees, and the progression of the power-ups is closer as well. So the challenge overall is more in line with the original arcade game too, compared to that slightly easier challenge offered by the NES or Famicom versions. There are, of course, a few downsides with that. Some of these, I would say, would be expected, like the lack of multiplayer. It's a bit of a shame you can't connect your GBA up to with a friend and play 2-player there, or 3-player, but it kind of makes sense. This was a budget-focused release, and so I can appreciate the developers not wanting to deal with the nightmare of debugging link cable connectivity issues. Sadly, the bigger one is with the controls, because they do suffer here, because they kind of channel that thing of the arcade game. Yes, there's going to be a lot of oversteer as you're getting used to them, and it's a bit of a frustration for me, because I found myself just turning around too much when trying to corner. It's something that really needs a lot of tuning to get right, and I think if this wasn't a budget release and the devs had the room to refine and tweak it, they probably could have gotten it done a lot better, but alas. Things like this are what let this conversion down for me. I can appreciate the work in bringing the arcade game down to a smaller screen to play it on the go, at least in principle, but it feels a little too much was lost in translation. There's also details with the sound which irritated, particularly the sound which is played when collecting a spanner. The way it's delayed is a relatively minor thing, but gosh, it can be so annoying when you're expecting you might have a chance at collecting one, but suddenly a rival does instead. Now, of course, in a way, sitting down to record the gameplay footage and playing the game on a big screen reduced some of the pain points for me. But as I sort of expressed here, it's not really the intended way you should be playing this version. And playing it on a handheld is actually kind of awkward, and it just doesn't feel right for me. Super Sprint is absolutely an iconic racing game. It takes the concepts of its predecessors from the 1970s and expands upon them to make something which would inspire many games released during the late 1980s to 1990s. As always, with any arcade conversion, the big question is why? Why play these versions when you can play the original, which is likely the best version, and when doing so is so much easier than trying to do so back in the day? For me, the finest home versions don't just transplant what the arcade game does, but they also make it work with the joysticks and controllers and gamepads you find connected to your favorite computer or console. It's the little things like that, as the NES and Famicom version demonstrate, which really helps make it stick out for me as an ideal way to play it. In fact, I had a lot of time with it for making this video, and I really found myself enjoying the game so much. I really enjoyed this version. I'm really glad I got a hold of it before it went rather obscene in pricing. And that is even with the loss of the 8 circuit, or the lack of jumps and gates. Those details, they're not really enough to get in the way for me having a wonderful time with Super Sprint on the NES and Famicom, and I'll admit, I think these feelings would be amplified had I been lucky enough to have a friend along for the ride. But gosh, I wish I could say I felt the same about the Game Boy Advance version. The fact I got the most enjoyment from it when I was sitting at my desk playing it connected to a bigger screen rather than on the system as intended really shows up the flaws of it here, and it shows the challenges the developers were up to in trying to reinterpret the visuals for the smaller screen. Remember, the GBA's resolution is less than a quarter of that of the original arcade game. A lot is going to be lost in translation here. Which, when you combine with the less than precise controls on offer that it has, and it's really one I feel misses the mark in so many ways. I grabbed it for curio's sake, and I'm kind of glad I did, but it's not one I can really enjoy, and I would have felt that even if I had this back in the day, I think I'd still feel the same about it. It's just, it suffers a little too much in translation. I guess what's left now is really to see whether Neosprint actually manages to live up to its predecessors, or if I'm still going to be wanting for that great overhead racing experience. But that's not really something for me to talk about here, and really with that, it's time to bring the checkered flag out for this one and draw it to a close. As always, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, the best thing you can do to help out is drop a comment or a little old like down below. Perhaps check the video description if you're watching on desktop, and most people seem to be, for some other ways you can help the show, or maybe even join our little community too. But most importantly, thank you all so very much for watching.